I've read some of your books, and the Sterling Moss biography is brilliant, and the relationship the two of you had is very obvious.
I was very lucky. I mean, what I always say, and this applies to my friendship with people like Sterling, my friendship at the time with people like Jochen Rindt and Piers Courage, and also throughout, I'm, unlike yourself, I'm no good with a spanner in my hands. I mean, I'm the epitome of the old saying, those that can do, those that can't talk about it. Obviously, I love the machinery. I love historic cars. I'm lucky enough to have a couple. And I love the races and the stories. But what I really love, and what's really made my last 60 years so lucky, are the people. I've known delightful people in motor racing. I've known a few nasty people in motor racing. I've known honourable people. I've known a few nasty people. But I've never known a boring person in motor racing. And that's what's so great. It's the people that I've been lucky enough to know.
Yeah. Well, it's been brilliant talking to you. We're going to do a bit of a part two, if that's okay with you, on some of your cars and you behind the steering wheel sort of thing. And
okay, whatever you like.
What I have been doing to finish up is, and it's going to be a tough question for you, but who has been the greatest driver of all time?
Let me answer that question by saying, first off, I don't like statistics. I don't like comparing numbers. And to me, there is no point in comparing Max Verstappen's number of pole positions, number of wins, number of championship points with Fangio's. In Fangio's day, there were as few as 6 or 7 rounds of the World Championship during the year. The cars were different, the circuits were different, the circumstances were different, the whole culture was different. You imagine what it was like racing maybe 10 years, 5 years, 10 years after the end of World War II. Some of the people who were racing had a few years before been sitting in Spitfires and Hurricanes or Lancasters, risking their lives every evening. So the whole perception of what you could do, how you could get your kicks, how you could get your fulfillment and satisfaction was different. And as we said earlier, health and safety had not been invented. It was so different that you might as well be comparing football and cricket. They were different sports. And therefore, I have no time for people who say Lewis Hamilton is the greatest driver ever or Max Verstappen is the greatest driver ever, because they're looking at statistics. Mm-hmm. Even more, the statisticians seem to think that Formula One racing, Grand Prix racing, started in May 1950. How ridiculous can that be when motor racing had been going for over half a century? So
I think ever since they were invented, people were putting them against each other. That was just men being men, or
That's absolutely right. So I think the question of who's the greatest driver of all time is meaningless. What you can do is either you can look at each era and say who was the best racing driver of their era, or you can say who was the driver who was better than everybody else in their era in the wet? Who was the driver who in his era was the most intelligent? Who was the driver who in his own era was the bravest or the most foolish? All of those can give rise to
potentially a different answer every time, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, you can be sitting over your 4th pint of beer in the pub arguing these things, and they're great arguments to have. Mm-hmm. And I'm very lucky in that I have watched a lot of motor racing. I don't like watching motor racing on television. Somebody said to me the other day, I love motor racing. He said, it's my favourite sport. I never miss a race. I said, really? You never miss a race? Well, he said, I'm on the sofa in front of the television for every race. I said, that's not watching motor racing. You haven't really experienced motor racing unless you've stood on an earth bank in the rain at Snetterton, or you've wandered around the paddock at Shelsley Walsh. Formula One is the pinnacle of the motorsport by some measures, not all, but it's a tiny percentage. I mean, even if you're talking about the top of motor racing, you can't ignore, to take one example, the Le Mans 24 Hours. You can't ignore special stage rallying. You can't even ignore the extraordinary skill of a hill climb championship contender finding an extra hundredth of a second within 23 seconds up Shelsley Walsh. It's all motorsport. And to think that motorsport consists of sitting on the sofa watching a television screen showing you Formula One is not to understand what motorsport is. However, let me go back to your question. There are so many drivers who had special abilities. Jackie Ickx in the rain, Pedro Rodriguez in a big sports car. Almost any of the great drivers had special skills. But I mean, obviously, Nuvolari, Fangio, Moss, Clark, Stewart, or Rindt, in their eras, were the greatest. I always remember a time sitting in the McLaren motorhome with James Hunt. I was by then a commentator, and James by then was a commentator. And whenever Murray was doing the bikes, in those days, the bike Grand Prix, the British bike Grand Prix anyway, would take precedence. So Murray would go off and do the bikes, and I would do the TV with James. And commentating with James, I can tell you, was a great experience. I always used to run like Murray. I used to dance around the commentary box. I'd get very excited. James would slouch in a chair. I'd be in the commentary box ready to go half an hour before the start of the race. James would wander in with 2 minutes to go, usually looking incredibly scruffy with flip-flops and cut-off jeans, with a bottle of wine which sat by his chair, and by the end of the race the wine would be empty. And yet he was wonderful to commentate with because he did speak as an ex-driver. I think only one man has been able to do what James did, and that's Martin Brundle. And he didn't try and do the commentator's job. He gave the commentator the insights which the commentator, who'd never raced a Formula One car, could not bring. And it was great doing it with him, but he was he was a bit of a liability. I remember there was the Belgian Grand Prix one year. Murray had this kind of love-hate relationship with James. I mean, in the end, he loved working with James. He hated because Murray was a courteous man, a true Englishman, always punctual, always thought of other people. Murray was a wonderful man, and I loved him dearly. James could not have been more different, although James was lovable as well. But at the Belgian Grand Prix one year, Murray was all ready to go. No sign of James. Cars went off on their warm-up lap. No sign of James. Finally, the cars were on the grid. Still no James. The race started, and Murray had to do the race single-handed. James never turned up. And at breakfast next morning in the hotel, Murray was sitting there having his full English, and James wandered down to breakfast. And Murray said, "James, what happened to you yesterday?" And James said, "Oh, sorry, Murray, I was in bed with a throat infection." And Murray said, "That's the first time I've heard 2 Belgian nurses being referred to as a throat infection."
Yes, it comes back to your the people in motorsport are one on their own, really, and it does sort of go back to what you were saying about watching motorsport as well. That it can't just be on the sofa watching it, because it is the people that make it. And if you go to Shelsley Walsh or Donington and you go and talk to the drivers, which most of them don't want to do before a race, but even just watching them and the way that they are composing themselves before a race, I think that's what makes it, and that's what made it for me as a child.
I absolutely agree. And of course, the great thing about somewhere like Shelsley Walsh, any member of the public can go into the paddock, can look at the cars closely, can hear them start up, can look under the bonnet when the bonnet's off. They can absolutely drink in the atmosphere. And of course, Shelsley Walsh, in terms of driving skill and seriousness and so on, I mean, certainly at the level that I do hill climbing, it's an infinity away from what professional racing drivers can do and their focus and so on. Nevertheless, it's one area where you can go and talk to the drivers and you can drink in the atmosphere. And that's really one of the things that has changed in modern motor racing. I know why it's changed. It's all changed for very understandable and sensible reasons, but it is different. It is different. But I am going to finish by mentioning the reason why I brought up James Hunt. We were talking about great drivers and their different characteristics and abilities. James Hunt and I were sitting in the McLaren motorhome on a Sunday morning, and James was holding forth in the excellent way he used to do, and he said, "What you've got to understand, Simon, is that it's not possible to be world champion in Formula One without being intelligent." And at that moment, Nelson Piquet walked past the window, and James said, "Mind you, there is an exception to every rule."
Brilliant. Well, it's been brilliant talking to you, and please.
I've given you fun. I always know I'm very hard to edit because
it's been brilliant, and I want to keep everything in, to be honest, and we'll split it up accordingly, because I think people will just love to listen to it, really. And we'll do a part 2. So if you want to tune in for the part 2, and we'll go and have a bit of a look round at Simon's lovely
All right,
motors.
Your shoes.